The morning I found that letter in my mailbox, my world turned upside down. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just the usual bills, flyers, and maybe a catalog or two. But there it was, an envelope from the HOA, and inside a message that sent my heart racing. They were foreclosing on my home, over a $55 fine. At first, I thought there had to be a mistake, a clerical error maybe, something easy to fix. I stared at that letter for a long time, reading the words over and over again, hoping they'd change. But they didn't. And in that moment, the house I'd worked so hard for, the quiet life I had built, all of it felt like it was slipping through my fingers. Fear set in quickly, the kind that makes your stomach drop and your thoughts race in 100 different directions at once. I tried to steady myself, thinking logically, how could this be happening? I paid my dues. I mowed my lawn. I kept the noise down. I never caused trouble, except Karen. Karen, my neighbor, had been a constant source of tension since the day she moved in. She had a way of making mountains out of molehills, and everyone on the street knew it. She had a talent for turning small issues into crusades and always seemed to have the HOA's ear. I started wondering, was this her doing? Had she whispered enough poison into the right ears to make this happen? I didn't have proof yet, but I had a feeling deep in my gut. So I did what I could. I started digging. I pulled out every document I had, scoured the HOA guidelines, combed through old emails and letters, and began building a picture of what was going on. My dad had always told me growing up, there's no problem too big if you break it down. He was a lawyer, and not just any lawyer. He had this quiet strength, a sharp mind, and an unwavering sense of justice. Though we hadn't spoken much about my HOA troubles, I knew he'd have my back if I needed him. For now, I needed facts. I spent hours online researching property laws, HOA rights, and similar cases where fines spiraled into something much bigger. And the more I read, the angrier I got. It turned out HOAs could, and often did, abuse their power. What was supposed to be a system for maintaining community standards had turned into something darker, more controlling. And people like Karen, they thrived in that environment. I started keeping a record. Every time Karen glared at me over the fence, every snide remark she made as I walked by, the times she stood too close to the HOA office door as if waiting for someone. I even recorded one of her rants from her porch, where she complained loudly about how some people didn't belong in her neighborhood. Her entitlement was staggering, and for the first time, I wondered how far she'd go to get her way. One night, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers, with a pen in my hand and a growing sense of purpose. If Karen was using her influence to sway the HOA, I needed to prove it. I mapped out the neighborhood, marked property lines, and cross-referenced them with the HOA's own documentation. I dug into meeting minutes and noted every time Karen showed up and what she said. There was a pattern, one that showed her targeting certain neighbors, especially ones she didn't like. I knew I needed help, so I called my dad. I explained everything, every letter, every meeting, every stare from Karen across the hedges. He listened without interrupting, like he always did. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then he said, "You're right. Something's off. We're going to fix this." And just like that, I wasn't alone anymore. The next few days were a whirlwind. My dad and I went through the legal side of things, him teaching me what each clause meant in plain English. We drafted letters and requests for information, citing the laws that the HOA had ignored. Every document we put together made me feel a little stronger, a little less afraid. My dad had a way of making the law feel like a shield instead of a weapon. Karen must have sensed I wasn't backing down because her behavior escalated. She started leaving notes on my door, short ones filled with veiled threats and passive-aggressive reminders about the HOA rules. I took pictures of them all and added them to my growing file. I didn't react. I didn't confront her. I wanted everything I did to be calm, measured, and above board. If this came to a legal fight, I wanted no one to question my integrity. The HOA meeting came quicker than I thought it would. I walked in with my dad by my side and a folder full of evidence in my hands. The board members sat behind a long table, their faces carefully neutral. Karen was there too, sitting in the front row with her arms crossed and a smug look on her face. I felt my pulse quicken, but I took a deep breath and reminded myself why I was there. I spoke clearly and slowly. I explained how a $55 fine, one I had never been properly notified about, had escalated without due process. I presented the documents that showed the HOA had skipped steps required by their own bylaws. I pointed out inconsistencies in their records and asked why Karen, who had an obvious personal bias, had been allowed to make repeated complaints without investigation. The room was quiet when I finished. Then Karen started in, loud and accusing, calling me a troublemaker and a liar. But this time, something shifted. People didn't look at me the way they used to, with suspicion or indifference. They looked at Karen, and for the first time I saw doubt in their eyes. After the meeting, things changed. Slowly at first. Neighbors I hadn't spoken to much started stopping by, asking questions, offering quiet support. One of them, Sam, told me how Karen had driven his cousin out of the neighborhood years ago with her constant complaints. Others shared similar stories. It was like a dam had broken, and the truth was finally spilling out. I took everything I had learned, everything I had collected, and I went to a local news station. I sat down with a reporter and told my story. I showed them the maps, the letters, and the recordings. I explained how a small fine had nearly cost me everything because of unchecked power and personal vendettas. When the story aired, it spread faster than I expected. The pressure on the HOA was immediate. People demanded answers. There were calls for a new board election. Karen's influence waned quickly. She stopped showing up to meetings and the angry notes stopped appearing on my door. But I wasn't done. My dad and I filed a formal complaint against the HOA for violating their own procedures. We pushed for a full audit of their practices. And when the dust settled, there was a new HOA board, one that promised transparency and fairness. I kept my home. But more than that, I reclaimed my peace of mind. I learned that standing up for yourself isn't about yelling the loudest. It's about knowing the truth, holding on to it, and refusing to back down, no matter how small your voice may seem. Karen moved away not long after that. Maybe she thought she'd find a new neighborhood to control, or maybe she realized her time was up. Either way, the street felt lighter without her looming presence. Now, when I walk by the HOA office, I do so with my head held high. I think about that $55 fine and how it almost changed everything. But in the end, it was the spark that led me to uncover the truth and protect not just my home, but the integrity of the whole community. And through it all, I found a strength I didn't know I had. One that came from standing firm, staying calm, and believing in the power of fairness and justice. I realized that even when the odds are against you, when the system feels rigged, there's always a way to fight back. You just have to be willing to take the first step. The weeks after winning my case against the HOA felt like a blur. It was as if the world had shifted overnight, yet life carried on with quiet normalcy. I still mowed my lawn on Saturdays. The mail still came at noon, but I wasn't the same. Something had changed deep inside me. I was sharper, more aware of the small details I used to overlook. And most of all, I was ready for whatever came next. Because if there was one thing I knew for sure, Karen wasn't done yet. At first, it seemed like she had vanished. Her house, once a hub of activity with HOA board members and neighbors constantly stopping by, was strangely silent. No more clipped footsteps on her porch. No more passive-aggressive greetings in the morning. But beneath the quiet, I could feel the tension, like a storm gathering on the horizon. I wasn't wrong. One cool evening, as the sun was slipping behind the rooftops, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find a man in a crisp suit standing there, holding a thick envelope. He introduced himself as a lawyer, Karen's lawyer. She was suing me. Defamation, harassment, emotional distress, the whole list. I took the papers with a steady hand, even though my pulse was pounding. I thanked him politely, closed the door, and immediately called my dad. When he arrived, he barely glanced at the lawsuit before shaking his head. "This is desperate," he said, "but we'll treat it seriously." His voice was calm, but I could tell he was angry. Not because of the lawsuit itself, but because he knew exactly what it was. An attempt to intimidate me, to wear me down until I gave up and left quietly. That wasn't going to happen. We spent the next few days gathering everything. Every note Karen had sent me, every recording, every neighbor's testimony, every HOA meeting minute where she'd made baseless accusations. My dad drafted a countersuit for harassment and malicious prosecution. He explained that if she wanted a legal fight, we'd give her one, but on our terms. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was changing. Word about the lawsuit spread quickly. Some people avoided me at first, probably afraid of getting caught in the middle of it, but others came forward. Sam stopped by with copies of emails he'd received from Karen years ago, pressuring him to vote a certain way in HOA elections. Another neighbor, Grace, found old letters where Karen had accused her of breaking the rules just for planting flowers that didn't fit the HOA's color scheme. The evidence was building, and Karen didn't even realize how many people she had alienated over the years. The community wasn't hers to control anymore. The court date came faster than I expected. I dressed simply. No flashy suits, no dramatic colors, just a clean, confident look. My dad stood beside me, his briefcase filled with carefully organized files. Karen sat across the room with her lawyer, looking composed on the outside. But there was something in her eyes that told me she wasn't as sure of herself as she used to be. As the hearing began, I listened as her lawyer listed off complaints. She was suffering, she had been slandered, she felt unsafe in her own home. I kept my face calm, but inside I was boiling. Not because of what they said, but because of the way they twisted the truth. I waited until it was our turn. My dad stood and spoke with a quiet authority that filled the room. He presented our evidence one piece at a time. No dramatic gestures, no raised voice, just fact after fact, laid out like bricks in a wall that couldn't be torn down. He explained how Karen had used her influence within the HOA to target neighbors she didn't like, how she had consistently violated procedures to enforce rules that weren't fairly applied, and then he showed them the letters, the recordings, the old minutes. He painted a picture so clear, even the judge sat back in his chair, eyebrows raised. When I spoke, I told them my story, how a $55 fine had turned into a foreclosure notice, how I had tried to fix things quietly but had been pushed to the edge, how I had never wanted to fight but wasn't willing to lose my home because of someone else's thirst for power. My voice was steady, honest. I saw the courtroom shift as I spoke, not because I was dramatic, but because I was telling the simple, painful truth. Karen's case fell apart. It didn't take long. The judge dismissed it with a sharp tone, making it clear that it was a waste of the court's time. But what happened next surprised me even more. The judge ordered an investigation into the HOA itself. He questioned whether their processes had been fair, whether they had allowed personal vendettas to influence their actions. Suddenly, the spotlight wasn't just on Karen, it was on the entire organization. When we walked out of the courtroom, it felt like I was breathing fresh air for the first time in months. But I knew it wasn't over yet. Karen had retreated, yes. But the HOA was still a machine, with gears turning behind closed doors. If I wanted real change, I had to keep pushing. The investigation into the HOA uncovered things I hadn't expected. There were financial discrepancies, fees collected but never accounted for, services paid for but never provided. A web of favors and backdoor deals that made Karen's petty vendettas look small by comparison. My dad and I worked with a group of neighbors to petition for a full audit. We held meetings, we passed out flyers, we knocked on doors, and slowly the tide turned. More people came forward with their stories. Some had been fined for ridiculous reasons. Kids' bikes left out too long, wind chimes that were too loud, holiday decorations taken down a day late. One family had nearly lost their home over an unresolved $100 fee they'd never been told about. Their experiences echoed mine, and I realized this wasn't about me anymore. It was about all of us. The HOA board finally agreed to step down after the audit revealed how badly things had been run. New elections were held, and this time, they were open, transparent, and fair. I didn't run for a board position, but Sam did. So did Grace, and a few others who'd once stayed silent. They promised to rebuild the HOA into something that protected the community, not controlled it. Karen's house went up for sale shortly after that. No one saw her pack. No one said goodbye. She left as quietly as she had once been loud. And when she was gone, the neighborhood felt different, lighter, safer. I stayed involved in the community after that, not because I wanted to be in charge, but because I understood how important it was to keep watch. We set up regular meetings where everyone had a voice. We rewrote the rules, making them simpler and fairer. We built a system where no one person could dominate or manipulate the process. But the biggest change wasn't in the HOA rules or the board. It was in the people. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves now came out to talk, to share, to look out for one another. There was a new sense of trust, fragile but growing. We planted trees together. We held block parties in the park. We became, for the first time in a long time, a real community. And as for me, I never forgot what it felt like to hold that foreclosure letter in my hands, to wonder if I'd lose everything because of a $55 fine and a neighbor with too much power. It stayed with me, but not as a scar, as a reminder of how easy it is to lose control when no one stands up, and how important it is to be the one who does. My dad still laughs sometimes when we talk about it. He says, "Who knew the HOA would give you such an education in the law?" And he's right. I learned how systems can fail, how people can exploit them. But I also learned how to stand up, to speak out, and to make things right. Looking back, I wouldn't say I'm glad it happened, but I am grateful for what it taught me. And I know now that even the smallest voice can start something big, something that changes everything. I still walk past the HOA office sometimes, and I smile. Not because I won, but because we all did. Because a small, quiet neighborhood finally found its voice. And because sometimes even a $55 fine can spark a revolution.